Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Ford Presidential Museum. My name is Elaine Didier, and it is my privilege to serve as director of both the museum here in Grand Rapids and the library in Ann Arbor. We are delighted to have you with us this afternoon for this special presentation. We're honored that President Bush selected the Ford Presidential Museum to be the site for this program, and as I told him just a few minutes ago, next year, 2011, is our 30th anniversary. And he was very impressed and pleased with that. And of course, I was very honored to be at the groundbreaking for his new library down at Southern Methodist University just a couple of weeks ago. So they'll be the newest and greatest and best, but we've got a lot of experience under our belts. It's rare that any presidential museum has the opportunity to host a former president or a first daughter, let alone both as a part of the same program, but that's our blessing today. But before we begin the program, I'd like to brief you on some logistical issues. And as you can imagine, to plan for this kind of event, there have been many logistical issues. First of all, for those of you who have pre-ordered President Bush's book, they will be available for pickup at the table near the front door, the same area where you signed in today. The books are ready for you in bags or in whole boxes, as might be the case, along with the receipts. So you'll go near the front door to pick up your books. For those who didn't pre-order or who want to purchase today and perhaps even buy some other materials for your holiday shopping in the museum store, those transactions will be handled at the regular museum admission desk. And in case you didn't notice as you came in, we have copies of books by Laura Bush and President George H.W. Bush, in addition to many others. For purchases today, in order that we share the bounty fairly for these wonderful signed copies, we're asking that each person just purchase 2 copies today. While I have you captive here prior to our program, being the director that I am, I cannot miss the opportunity to alert you to some upcoming programs. First of all, the Betty Ford exhibit upstairs runs through February 27th. If you haven't seen it yet, it is eye candy. It is a fabulous array of vivid and colorful dresses and other things that are a feast for the eyes. So be sure to come between now and the end of February. In conjunction with that exhibit on February 9th, we're holding Carl Anthony, who is the author of 2 books on First Ladies, and he will be discussing none other than our favorite First Lady, Betty Ford. So that's February 9th. But before that, coming up between now and the holidays, on Tuesday, December 14th, we are honored to be hosting the Honorable William T. Coleman, who was Secretary of Transportation in the Ford administration. This program will also feature Mr. Coleman's daughter, Lavinda, who assisted with his book, Counsel for the Situation, Shaping the Law to Realize America's Promise. So that's a Tuesday night, the 14th, and if that night doesn't work for you, I can invite you to the Ford Presidential Library in Ann Arbor on Monday night, the 13th, to have Mr. Coleman speak there. Both of those programs are starting at 7 o'clock rather than our usual 7:30. Looking forward, we have a number of other programs and another new feature exhibit opening in the spring, so you're all friends of Ford. Pay attention to the mailings and our website, and we'll look forward to seeing you there. Now let me speak for a moment about the format for today's program. We are all honored and privileged today to be part of a conversation with former President George W. Bush. The President will be introduced by Susan Ford Bales, the daughter of President and Mrs. Ford. Susan is a former photojournalist and author of 2 books of fiction set in the White House. She is a highly articulate spokesperson on issues related to breast cancer and has also been extremely active with the Betty Ford Center, where she served as chairman of the board for 5 years. She is a dedicated and active trustee of the Ford Presidential Foundation and an avid supporter of all that we do here at the library and museum. The conversation with President Bush will be moderated by Dr. Al Feely, who will draw on the questions you have submitted this afternoon, along with some of his own. Dr. Feely is director of the Gerald R. Institute for Leadership in Public Policy and Service at Albion College. Dr. Feely's professional field is epidemiology, and he has been active in national health policy issues by serving as a Robert Wood Johnson Fellow in the Office of Senator John Rockefeller of West Virginia, and a Congressional Fellow with the American Political Science Association in Washington. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Officer Walter Tett of the Grand Rapids Police Department, who will sing the national anthem. If you are able, please join me in standing for the anthem.
Mr. President, Al Feely. Feely, Secretary Land, Joe Calvaruso, trustees and staff of the Foundation and Museum, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, but most of all, the armed forces that we have here with us today. Please give them a hand. This is a wonderful afternoon here in Grand Rapids at Dad's Museum. Today is a magnificent occasion to us to host somebody who, with his family, has an extraordinary decades-long friendship with Dad and the Ford family. I thought a lot about how to adequately describe the depth of the friendship and love between the Bush and the Ford families. Ladies and gentlemen, it has not been an easy task. As many here today will recall, in the twilight of his life, Dad often remarked, "When I wake up at night and can't sleep, I think of Grand Rapids." When Dad would say that, one other thing always happened. He would get a great big smile on his face. Mr. President, as I reflected on the special friendship between our two families, my thoughts keep coming back to the single image of Dad's smile. I remembered when you and Laura hosted us at the White House to celebrate Dad's 90th birthday. It was a wonderful evening, and the Ford family and the Bush family were together again. And that entire evening with you and Laura, and the photo here out in the museum lobby, vividly captures Dad's unmistakable smile was ever present. In April of 2006, you visited Dad and Mom at their home in Rancho Mirage. And at the end of your visit, Dad walked you to your car. He stood quietly on the step and watched you as the motorcade drove away. And there, reflecting the boundless pride and friendship of our two families, was Dad's unmistakable smile. But several months later, Dad passed away. And those several days of his state funeral were difficult indeed. And they were especially difficult for Mom. The pain the public saw on her face was also there in our private moments. But one afternoon that week, while we were in Washington, you and Laura came to the Blair House to visit Mother. No fanfare, no entourage, just the President and First Lady, coming to comfort Mom. And Mr. President, the three of you visited for quite a while that afternoon, and then quietly I came into the room and joined you. And I will always cherish my memory of that moment. Amidst a sea of tears and sadness, there were you and Laura and Mom, and yes, for the first time in days, a huge smile on her face. And I will never forget that smile. And most of all, I will never forget the friendship and love from the Bush family that Mother's smile that day will represent, always. So it is a personal joy and honor to welcome you with a big smile. A man of principle and compassion, a man of impeccable integrity and honesty, a man of courage and humility, a man my father deeply respected and was so proud to call his friend, and a man who once again today has brought the Bush family and the Ford family together. Ladies and gentlemen, the 43rd President of the United States, George W. Bush.
Man, what an introduction. Susan, thank you very much. Very sweet. She and I are members of an exclusive club, Children of the President's Club. An honor to be here. Thank you for coming. Yeah, ready to go, Al?
All right, good. I'd also like to thank you for being here and taking time to talk to us today. Your book, Decision Points, has now been out a few weeks. It's sold record numbers of copies, and it's been on the top of the New York Times bestseller list since it came out. How's it feel to be a best-selling author?
Yeah, well, some people are in shock that I can even read, much less I had a fabulous experience writing the book. It's a little odd to go from 100 miles an hour to 0. That's exactly what happened. I watched my successor get sworn in, which was an amazing ceremony. I love the fact that we transfer power peacefully in the United States. And then got on an airplane and flew back to our beloved state of Texas. And I woke up the next morning, and there wasn't much to do. So I started writing. I thought about this book ahead of time, and I planned it, but I was busy up to the last minute of my presidency. And so I first started writing it when I got home that day, and it was a really, really good experience. I'm pleased people are buying the book. For those of you who bought it, I thank you. For those of you who haven't, give it a look, you know. A lot of pictures.
I knew this was going to be fun when I got here. So it's laid out a little bit differently than most other books are. Can you tell me how you chose the format of the book?
Yeah, thanks, Al. Look, what he's basically asking is, why did I organize around decisions? You'd expect a presidential memoir to be, you know, I was born in the windy deserts of West Texas, which I wasn't. I was actually born my father's sophomore year in college. It all checked out. But I decided it would interest the reader to know what it was like to be president during some consequential times. And the best way I felt to organize the book to hopefully draw your attention and keep you interested was to organize around set decisions, which were consequential. And I hope you like it done that way. The other thing I think is interesting about the book, it's very anecdotal. And the reason it's anecdotal is, one, I like stories. And I like to read history based on anecdotes. And I called a group of historians in the Oval in the last year of my presidency and asked their advice. And to a person, they said, you ought to read U.S. Grant's memoirs. It's called Memoirs. But it's about his time, not as president, but it's about his time in the military. And it's an interesting read. And it's obviously stood the test of time. Otherwise, 21st century historians wouldn't be recommending it to somebody seeking the best way to write a book. And it's a narrative held together by anecdotes. And so the first line of the book is, can you tell me a day in which you haven't had a drink? It's an interesting way to start a presidential memoir. It's my wife asking me that question. And I don't, maybe some of you drank too much. I certainly was. And the answer when you get to ask that question, yeah, I can tell you. And then I couldn't remember a day. And the whole point of the story is that I needed to quit drinking. And I would tell you, I wouldn't be sitting here as a former president had I not quit drinking. But and the reason that's in the book, in other words, I brought that up to show you kind of how that anecdote works. It's a story of her telling me, you're drinking too damn much. And the reason it's in the book is that the first decision in the book is why run for president at all. In order to make that decision meaningful to you, I have to describe the person making the decision. One of the key moments in my life was the decision to quit drinking.
And I applaud your courage for putting that right up in front in the book, especially in the first chapter. How difficult was it to put that into words?
Not too hard, I mean, look, I'm not seeking votes. It's not hard at all. I was signing a book in Houston, and a lady walked up and said, my 37-year-old son read your book and wants to quit drinking. I mean, it honored me that she would say that. Hopefully this is a contribution. I'm beyond worrying about, frankly, what people think. And what I'm trying to do is write something that'll stand the test of time. I will tell you, I've studied a lot of history and read a lot of history when I was the president. Still love reading history. And I just wanted to contribute, be a data point for a time when objective historians finally show up. I say that cynically, I say that realistically. There is no way that history can be viewed objectively until enough time passes. I mean, take, for example, Susan's father, pardon of Richard Nixon at the time. Any historian would write about it, they would be aghast. You know, and he was condemned by people in the short term. In the long term, it's turned out to be one of the great presidential decisions. A selfless decision, you know, a decision that likely cost him the presidency, but nevertheless a decision that when viewed objectively and weighed in a way that is devoid of the prejudice of the moment, is seen differently now. And so when people show up that have enough time and perspective, I hope this is a place where some historians turn to, and they get the perspective of a person who happened to be in the middle of the action.
Thank you. You share something special with John Quincy Adams, in that both of you had fathers who were presidents. What was it like to watch your father as president?
Yeah, it's painful. I bet Susan says the same thing. I bet if you were to bring all children of presidents together and they say, what's the worst thing about your father being president? They say, watching him be criticized. Unless you don't love the guy, you know, in which case it doesn't matter to you. Well, I like Susan, I love my dad a lot. And there's a lot of psychobabble about father and son rivalry and all this stuff. Forget it. Just read the book, you'll see that I adore George H.W. Bush. He's a remarkable guy. And he's an awesome dad. And so when people criticized him, I didn't like it. And frankly, didn't react very well. I was unpleasant to people who criticized my father. Because I was reacting not out of politics, but out of love. And so therefore, what's interesting about this whole kind of tutelage, in a way, was that when I became president, the criticism meant nothing relative to watching him get criticized, interestingly enough. And what was fascinating, I spent a little time in the book alluding to this, but our roles got reversed. People would often say, well, did you constantly talk to your dad about advice? And the answer is no, I didn't. I usually spent time listening to my mother, who would tell me to call my dad because he had just read some ugly editorial, most likely in an East Coast newspaper. But he needed to be comforted because he was hurting, and I knew exactly what he was going through because I'd gone through the same thing. And so it was an interesting experience to watch your dad be president. And it was tough, and it was also unbelievably gratifying. There's nothing more proud. You love the person, nothing more proud to see him get sworn in as president. And what's really fun is that the White House goes out of its way to accommodate the first family. And so Camp David was fun, and Christmas in the White House. And I'm sure Susan invited whoever she wanted to come and spend the night, and they would accommodate. Our girls certainly did. And anyways, the pluses far outweigh the minuses, don't get me wrong. But the minuses were watching somebody that you love get hit on in the press and by political opponents.
So did he give you tips and help you out when you were in the presidency?
Well, he didn't need to. I'd seen him. I mean, his living example was tip enough. And the biggest tip is that you can be a good dad and be president. You don't have to sacrifice your values to be president, is another good tip. But he also knew what I know, and that is that action happens so quickly inside the Oval Office, and the information flow is so different to the current president from former presidents that, the advice is basically, I love you, son, hang in there, as opposed to trying to fine-tune policy. And there was a moment in the book where I was with him at Camp David, and we were talking about Iraq. This is the run-up to Iraq, and I told him I was going to try everything I could to solve the problem diplomatically, which is what the American people should expect of their president. And when you read the chapter on Iraq, you'll see we went out of our way to solve this thing peacefully. This thing being the threat that Saddam Hussein posed. The threat that everybody in both parties, not everybody, most people in both parties saw at the time. And he said, I said, Dad, I may have to use troops. He said, well, if you do, I hope it's at the last resort, or something. I'm paraphrasing. But the point was, yeah, I mentioned it to him. I didn't say, can I have your permission? I just told him, I briefed him on what we were doing. And my view was, if he had something to add, he would have.
And how is your dad and how is your mom doing?
Thanks, good. They're doing great. So I measure their spirits, to answer your question. Their spirits are high, and which is learning more and more is important in life. And, but thanks for asking. Their mother's still telling me what to do on a regular basis.
I saw a lot of that in the book, too.
Yeah, there is. Yeah. You know, I describe my relationship with my dad, which I just described to you, but I spent a lot of time on my relationship with my mother. I had a little sister. They had a young daughter who died early. So I was 6 and she was 3. And mother just smothered me with love as the one child that could communicate. Jed was like hardly born. And so I'm convinced that's why my closeness to my mother evolved. And interestingly enough, I picked up a lot of her characteristics, which got me in trouble, like blunt tongue. She did great.
Throughout your book, you weave in the strength that family, friends, and faith have given you. Can you tell us about a time that was particularly daunting for you and how you used that to get through?
Well, you know, I do talk about my faith journey, and I don't do it reluctantly. I did speak about it slightly reluctantly when I was president, because I'm worried about politicians who say, vote for me, I'm more religious than you, which means you're generally not religious. I'm worried about, you know, people say, well, it's a certain kind of religious policy. I happen to believe the great strength of America is we can worship anyone. And it doesn't matter if you're, you know, what you are, whether you're Methodist or Muslim or Jewish or Hindu, it just doesn't matter. What matters is that we have the right to choose. And so, but in the book I needed to describe religion because it helps describe me. And I viewed faith as a journey. You know, and I put in there, you know, I used to go to sermons and I would listen but not hear. And faith became central in my life after a while. Still, but it was difficult. It's difficult to set aside ego. And still difficult. But during the presidency, faith provided a lot of comfort and strength. You know, one of the things that's important about leading an organization is to have a set of principles that are inviolate, that you won't compromise. And so I've often thought about how you gain principles. I mean, how do you develop a set of principles that become the core of your philosophy? And I believe it's through your faith. So, for example, one of the cornerstones of my foreign policy is my belief in an Almighty, and a gift of that Almighty to everybody is freedom. Not just, you know, white guy Methodists, but the gift is to all people. So in other words, I believe in the universality of freedom. That's got to be based somewhat on a religious principle. I believe you develop principles based upon how you were raised, and finally where you're raised. And during the toughest moments of the presidency, I was able to be sustained by faith. And one of the most remarkable things about the presidency was the fact that people's prayers sustained me, which I never would have predicted. Like when I'm 30, if I was 30 years old, somebody said, oh man, someday prayer is going to sustain you and lift you up. I would have said, forget it. Are you kidding me? Who needs it? I don't believe you. Well, 64, having been through this experience, it mattered. And our family mattered a lot. And so you're in the midst of, you know, some of the tough moments. The toughest moment, of course, as a president is to commit troops into harm's way. It's the consequences of which are significant for everybody involved. And so it was comforting to have people around who you loved. And I'm not poetic enough to describe why. But I can tell you to have my brother and sister around, for example, in the midst of the Iraq War, you know, kind of got my mind off of the trauma and the difficulties of the war, and put me in a mood in which I was relaxed. Maybe it took me back to some of my childhood. I don't know. I'm not a psychopath, but I do know that it made a difference. And then my friends were great, you know. And I had friends Laura and I had friends who were our friends when we were kids. And they were our friends before the presidency, during the presidency, and could care less about, you know, they weren't judgmental, let me put it to you that way. And so they brought a lot of solace too. And so our faith, family, and friends have been important throughout my life. Sometimes I recognize it more than others, but during the presidency, I really recognize the importance of all three.
You have a chapter in the book entitled Personnel, and so how you picked your key advisors and your other staff. As we're sitting here today in the auditorium of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Museum, and thinking about some of those staff members that you shared with
Right.
President Ford, can you talk to us a little bit about picking Dick
Well,
Cheney as your running
There are
mate?
two for certain that pop out in my mind, Dick Cheney and Don Rumsfeld. And sure, I'll be glad to. The vice presidential decision by a presidential candidate is a glimpse into how someone might, if fortunate enough to become elected, make decisions. So I took it very seriously. And the first thing was to set up a process so that people would say, you know, old George W. will be thorough when it comes time to making an important decision. And I asked Dick Cheney if he would be the person to lead the process, because I knew it'd send a signal that I wasn't afraid to surround myself with experience, that I appreciated strong people, and that I entrusted the process to somebody who was trusted. And as Dick did the search, it became evident to me, and I got to know him better, it became evident to me as I thought through the names that were being batted around that he was the guy. Because, secondly, the key thing about the vice presidential pick is that the person be able to be president. You know, I mean, obviously there's politics involved, which turns out the 3 electoral votes in Wyoming were significant. But that's not important as far as I was concerned. What was important is, would the country take a look at the vice presidential pick and say, that person could be president? Secondly, it's helpful to have a vice presidential pick make up for presidential weakness, or candidate weakness. And in my case, I didn't have a lot of Washington experience. I was a Texas governor. You know, I had a Washington name to a certain extent. But I'd never really lived there and spent time there. I didn't know wandering around the halls of Capitol Hill. I had never done that. And so therefore Dick Cheney filled that void. Thirdly, I was confident, and I did ask my dad about this, what kind of guy would Cheney be when the pressure got on? You know, and because I was wise enough to understand, or experienced enough to understand, when everything's going fine, you know, it doesn't matter. But when it's when times get tough, that you really want to understand the nature of the people who are going to be inside the administration. And Dad gave him high marks. And the fourth thing was, you know, I really thought, did I want somebody who was thinking about running for president, him or herself? And, you know, I'd seen enough of president and vice president interaction to really think I was pretty comfortable with somebody not running for president serving with me, which creates a, you know, kind of a different set of, you know, needs. Somebody running for president tends to maybe sometimes cause them to want to distance themselves from the president if things were to happen to get tough, as opposed to create, you know, fractures in the West Wing. And so I said to Dick, I said, "You're it. You're the guy." And the good news is that confirmed my choice was he didn't want to do it. And you know, and neither did Karl Rove. And I put a scene in the book, an anecdote in the book, about Karl expressing his concern about picking Dick Cheney. And I pretty much made up my mind, you know, that's going to go that way. And so, and I was hopeful Karl would go to Washington, and hopefully we'd win. Of course, Dick would be there. So I decided to have a meeting with Dick Cheney, me, and Karl, and let him explain to Dick Cheney and me why he didn't think Dick Cheney was the right guy. So I wanted to see how Dick would react, and I wanted to see how Karl would react. And it turns out Dick agreed with Karl. I hope you can take a management lesson out of that. Seriously, if there's a potential problem, don't let it fester. And obviously you got to handle the situation in a fairly diplomatic way. You got to warn everybody it's going to happen. But at the meeting, what the meeting's going to be about. But anyway, I picked Dick. I'm glad I picked him then. I'm glad I picked him now. He was a great vice president, and you know, I know he got characterized in the press. It was unpleasant at times, but you know what? So did I. That's what happens. And his advice was steady. When the crises were on, he was calm, cool, and collected. He gave me his unvarnished opinion. Sometimes sometimes it meshed with my decisions. Sometimes it didn't. All times, though, it was yes, sir, Mr. President. And the other person was Don Rumsfeld, who, of course, was trained by Susan's dad, he was a fine Secretary of Defense. I do describe what it was like to see creative tension turn into destructive tension. For the first couple of years of the administration, the relations between the State Department and the Defense Department were just fine. But there's a built-in antagonism that is historically true, and I recall that the Secretary of State Kissinger and Defense Secretary Schlesinger might have had a few difficulties during the Ford administration, during the Reagan administration. Schultz and Weinberger had some difficulties. During the Bush administration, 43, we had some difficulties. And I had described in the book how my first choice for Secretary of Defense was not Don. I was going to consider him to be the head of the CIA. My first choice was Fred Smith, a person closer to my age, someone I was comfortable with. I'd gone to Yale. When he went to Yale, he started FedEx, a Silver Star winner in the U.S. Marine Corps, knew the military, and knew how to organize big organizations. And Freddie had a heart attack so therefore we took him out of the running. And it was actually Condi who suggested that I think about Don Rumsfeld to be Secretary of Defense. And so anyway, the creative tension started getting ugly. I put in the book, see, I can only tell you the story from my perspective, and my perspective was this. Rumsfeld and Powell looked like two old duelers who holstered their pistols in order their seconds and thirds to fire away. I tried to manage the situation, but it became unmanageable. And so the only solution at this point, this is in 04, if I were fortunate enough to win re-election, was to change everybody. And obviously I didn't. Don stayed on. And I thought about Condi, be Secretary of Defense, but I wanted her Secretary of State. And I thought about Jimmy Baker when I actually asked him, talked to another Ford alumni. And I was thinking maybe the triple crown of the cabinet positions would entice him. He said, no, he's happy in Houston. And the truth of the matter is, if you've got troops in combat, you can't create vacuum. And it takes a special mentality to be running the Defense Department at a time of war. And so I didn't make a change there. Don did a lot of really good things. One of the things he did, and one of the reasons I picked him, is that our military needed to be modernized. It needed to be more lethal, more light, more passive to move, reorganized, and he did it. And I love our military, I love our military families, but sometimes the military bureaucracy is tough to budge. And it requires someone like Rumsfeld, who is hard-nosed and experienced. After all, he was the youngest Secretary of Defense ever, and became the oldest Secretary of Defense ever.
So do you still stay in contact with him since you've left office?
Some, not too much. I'm mainly in touch with Condi, and Stephen Hadley, who's National Security Advisor, who followed Condi, Josh Bolton, Chief of Staff, and Carl, but not so much Dick and Don.
And we did ask the audience to fill out a few questions as well, and one of them I liked as I was going through it said, did Dick Cheney ever say to you, Jerry Ford used to do it this way?
No. No, he didn't. But I did ask, from your experiences during Ford's time, what did you learn? I mean, how would this be handled? No, the role of advisor is when the president says, what is your advice on this issue? Have you studied the issue, which they had by the time they made it up to the Oval Office? What's your advice? The key thing about the presidency, and probably I'm sure it's like running a big corporation, like Boss has done, or others, is to make sure that your advice is not necessarily, dumbed down. That you create an environment in which strong-willed, smart people walk in and say, here it is, Mr. President, here's what I think. The danger is when you get to be president, is people walk in and say, oh man, you're looking pretty today. And you're not. And it's really important to understand that as a head of an organization, you got to create a culture in which people speak their mind, but also a culture in which once a decision is made, it is, yes sir, we're going to implement your decision. And the truth of the matter is, if anybody has a problem doing that, then they need to leave. And that needs to be clear as well. In other words, if you got a problem with the decision I made, there's no need for you to be in the team anymore. That may sound harsh to people, but the stakes are too high to have people around who don't agree with you on the decision. They may not, in other words, they don't agree on once implemented. Fine, they may not agree. A lot of decisions I made, people didn't agree with. I'll give you one. So I decide to go to the United Nations for the second time to get a resolution. And I walk you through that decision. The first time I went through, we had a split decision in the administration. Did I need to go, or should I go, not did I need to, should I go to the United Nations and ask for a Security Council resolution to say to Saddam, which eventually happened, disclose, disarm, or face serious consequences? Some in the administration said there's no need to do that. The United Nations has already passed 17 or whatever it was resolutions, and he completely ignored them. What you ought to do is issue an ultimatum to let the inspectors back in, and if he doesn't, then we'll use armed force. I made the decision to go to the UN. I did because I wanted allies to join us, and it turns out, and I don't think most Americans really realize this, that if you don't have a UN resolution in hand, and you're a prime minister of a U.S. ally, you can't get parliamentary backing to fund, troops, for example. So the question at hand was a second resolution. Tony Blair asked for a second resolution. And nobody in the administration was for it. On the national security team. And I was. And we went. And we didn't get it, but we went. And the effort mattered to our allies, see? Now, what I'm telling you is, I've been reading in the newspaper about so-and-so said, how foolish of President Bush to do this. Once I made the decision, then the team would have been fractured. They may think that. But to be out there not implementing, for example, Colin Powell didn't think we ought to go, and yet he carried the ball at the UN. And my only point was that you need to have an environment in which people speak their mind, and then an environment in which people realize they're not there to serve me or to serve a Republican Party, but to serve the country and implement the President's decision.
The American people watched as the early events of 9/11 unfolded and saw you at the Florida Elementary School, received that information as you were reading to the children. You were calm and composed on what you call one of the most consequential days of your presidency. How did that affect the rest of your time?
Well, it did. It was it totally affected my presidency, and it affected me. And the truth of the matter is, it affected the country in a big way. I put in there that in the book that many of the decisions that followed September the 11th were incredibly controversial, and but flowed from the fact that we've been attacked. When I was looking at the kids after Andy Card had whispered a second plane hit the second tower, and I saw their innocence. My role as your president became clarified, which was to protect us, is to do what was necessary within the law for the American people. And that became, I thought about it every day as your president. I knew the farther we got away from the attack, the less concerned people would be. Which is good, that's what you want. You want the country to go back to normal, but the presidency couldn't go back to normal. And so there's a lot of decisions in the book that stem from the attack. Like whether or not we ought to be listening to the phone calls of dirty numbers emanating from a part of the world where people were planning to hurt us in order to find out what they were thinking, what they were getting ready to do. And so I'll walk you through those decisions. And I knew they'd be controversial. but I also knew my biggest job was to protect you, and I'd do it again.
Thank you. You spent a large part of your book discussing foreign policy, especially related to Iraq and Afghanistan. Walk us through the decision process that you had leading up to decisions about Iraq and the surge.
On Iraq, after 9/11, we had to look at the world differently. We could no longer kind of see a threat and do nothing about it. In other words, the consequences of the attack, in which 3,000 people died on our soil, was that we had to preempt threats. We had to deal with them before they fully materialized. And we reviewed the world, and after the liberation of 25 million people in Afghanistan by removing the Taliban, Saddam was a threat. He's a sworn enemy of the United States. He cheered the attacks of September the 11th publicly. We all thought he had weapons of mass destruction. After all, he had used them. Kicked out UN inspectors. In other words, he denied the world insight into what he was doing. And I decided to confront the threat before it fully materialized. Some of the critics said, well, I tried to link September the 11th and Saddam. No, I never did that, just so you know. And there's no reference to it in the book, because it just never happened. But I did say that we got to deal with it and put a big coalition together, and then went to the United Nations. And the United Nations, in a unanimous vote, said disclose, disarm, or face serious consequences. I happen to be one of these guys that when you say something, you better mean it. In other words, words can be empty, and all that does is just reinforce the bad behavior of tyrants, for example. When you say something in the American president, it's got to mean something, and I meant it. And you'll read about a policy that's called coercive diplomacy, that a diplomatic track, a robust diplomatic track on the one hand, but a military buildup on the others to make the diplomatic track work. In other words, there has to be consequences for delay and denial, and I knew that, and therefore have coercive diplomacy as the cornerstone of our policy in the hopes that diplomacy would work. I say this in the book, and I believe it, that the choice about whether or not the United States and a lot of other nations eventually used military was based upon Saddam Hussein. It was his choice to make. And for whatever reason, he didn't believe. Maybe it's because he's conditioned not to believe, but he didn't believe that the United States was serious about removing him. A huge disappointment, obviously, is the fact that we didn't find the weapons of mass destruction that everybody thought he had. Now remember, and one of the things that's important about a book like this, at least as far as I'm concerned, and many of the people who work with me, is that I went to the Congress and got a resolution that authorized me to use any means necessary to protect the country from Saddam Hussein, both supported widely by both Republicans and Democrats. It's odd, the political system at times got tough. A few of them forgot about the vote, but nevertheless, it was it's history. And completely different by the way, when my dad tried to get his vote to remove Saddam Hussein from a country that Saddam invaded, Kuwait, it was like a 52-48 vote to authorize George H.W. Bush. Well, George W. had a big vote because everybody saw the threat, and I took, I had that authorization in hand, supported by the U.S. Congress as I made the decisions. History oftentimes doesn't, analyze what the world would look like had a decision not been made. And I fully believe the world is a lot better off. I know 25 million Iraqis, or maybe 24.5 million Iraqis, are a lot better off without Saddam Hussein in power. The guy's a thug who stayed in power through brute force and torture, and his sons were unspeakably violent people. The human condition has improved greatly. Even though he didn't have the weapons we all thought, he had the capacity to make them, and would have been emboldened to do so had we not followed through on on the words that were said. I believe you'd be witnessing, or likely be witnessing, a nuclear arms race between Iran and Iraq now. And the Middle East is a lot better off without him. And America's more secure without him. And history will be the judge.
So do you still envision that Iraq could be the democratic pillar that can reform or transform the Middle East?
I think it will be a democratic pillar. There's already thriving democracy in Israel, in the Middle East. Lebanon is a struggling democracy, no question about it, but it is a democracy. Middle Eastern nations are reforming, some at a snail's pace, but nevertheless headed in the right direction. And I believe, an example of democracy, an Iraqi democracy, not an American democracy, it's an Iraqi democracy in the heart of the Middle East will be transformative. And the fundamental question a lot of Americans are probably asking is, does it matter? One, will freedom take hold in a part of the world that is, from which people came to kill citizens on our soil, and does it matter? And my argument is it really matters if you're interested in peace. If peace is your goal, which it's got to be a goal for any American president, it matters a lot whether people live in free society. You know, and I describe an interesting relationship that I developed during my presidency, and that was with the Japanese Prime Minister Koizumi. Most people, oh, what's the big deal, you know? Japan and the United States have been friends for years. Well, not 60 years ago. It isn't frankly all that long when you're 64. I mean, it's just like that. My dad fights the Japanese, and on September the 12th, I get a phone call from the Japanese Prime Minister saying the United States and Japan will work together to enhance our mutual security and spread freedom as the alternative to the ideology of those who kill people on your soils. A remarkable conversation, full of irony. Fathers fight, and the sons work to keep mutual security and spread freedom in what I view as an ideological conflict. And that conversation was not a given. Like in '44, somebody in Grand Rapids, Michigan said, I predict someday America and Japan will stand shoulder to shoulder to enhance mutual security. So what a hopeless, idealistic nut you are. Because it sounded far-fetched. But democracy transformed an enemy to an ally. I know it sounds far-fetched from some to believe people want to be free in the Middle East and that freedom will take hold. I think it will, because I happen to believe freedom is universal. I believe deep in everybody's soul is a desire to be free. And I believe that a democracy in what was used to be a tyranny will set a powerful example for others. And fundamental questions with the United States hang in there with the young democracy. One of the interesting choices I had to make as president, a decision, was whether or not once we removed Saddam Hussein to impose our own leader on the Iraqi people. So, okay, here's the guy, you follow him. And I chose not to, both in Afghanistan and Iraq. Because I believe that the best government that will yield to peace is one decided by people, not by a liberator in this case. And I knew it was going to be hard work. I didn't realize at times how hard it's going to be. And I tell you that in the book. But I'm glad you asked the question, because I gave a speech in Korea this year. And the stadium was full of 65,000 or 50,000, whatever the number was, a lot, of people who practice religion freely and openly. This is the 60th year of the Korean War. And it was not a given that those 60,000 people would be able to worship freely. And the fact that they are is a testament to our military, to the patience of the United States of America in the belief that freedom is transformative, and the courage of the Korean people. And the gift given to our country and me as president was that Korea has a peaceful effect in a part of the world in which there used to be unspeakable violence. And so the job of the president is to look beyond the horizon and to have faith in certain principles. And I describe it to you in the book, and I won't be around to fully answer that question. But yeah, to answer your question, I absolutely believe that democracy will take root and it'll be transformative.
Staying with the foreign relations and international issues, yesterday in recognition of World AIDS Day, you wrote an op-ed piece in the Washington Post talking about our success against the war on HIV and AIDS across the globe. In fact, the United Nations, which you mentioned in your article has said that we probably turned the tide on HIV and AIDS, that we may be seeing a reversal there. When you were in the presidency, some of your supporters and detractors were surprised when you introduced the PEPFAR initiative, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Repair. Can you tell us about that and some of your travels there?
Well, I devoted a whole chapter to this in the book, because I think it's an important decision. First of all, yeah, they're surprised. Evidently, Republicans are supposed to be compassionate people. I'm not sure why. And people in my own party were surprised, because why spend money, you know, in another part of the world? Some of them were. And here's why. One of the principles that I've tried to live my life on, sometimes successfully, sometimes not as successfully, is to whom much is given, much is required. I know Grand Rapids benefits when people live under that call. And I believe that I benefit as a person, and so do you, when you live under that call. Condi, when I was courting her to become a key player on our campaign, talked to me about Africa, and she wanted to make sure that I understood the significance of Africa. And I gave her a pledge that I would worry about problems in Africa should I win, and hopefully she'd be with me. She said, by the way, if you worry about Africa, then you have to worry about a pandemic that is wiping out an entire generation of people. And when I started reading about the pandemic, my heart was stirred, it truly was. And I felt that it was in our national security interest, as well as in our moral interest, to see if we could help. From a national security perspective, we face an enemy that can only recruit when they find hopeless people. Their ideology is not hopeful. It's kind of dim view of the world. And you got to be pretty hopeless to sign up, and maybe one of your tasks would be a suicide bomber. And there's nothing more hopeless than to watching your mom and dad die of AIDS and rich nations do nothing about it. To me, that's hopelessness. It's sadness, and frustration equals hopelessness. And so from a national security perspective, I felt it was important to address hopelessness where we could. But also, I felt we'd be a better nation if we could say to ourselves, we saw an entire generation of people getting wiped out in the great United States of America. Our collective heart wanted to do something about it. And so the PEPFAR came from that spirit. And so the malaria initiative. And I also believe that we're a wealthy enough nation to take care of our own and help others as well. I do. And so I laid out the initiative. And it was a remarkable experience to travel to Africa in 2008 on the Good Leader Tour. In other words, I also kind of started directing additional foreign aid to countries in which the leaders fought corruption and invested in their education and health of their citizens and supported the marketplace. And we went on the Good Guys Tour, people who did that. I'll never forget getting off the plane in Tanzania, and they were appreciative of America, and the one way they expressed their appreciation was saying nice things about the president. And they had dresses, cloth for dresses made with my picture on it. And quite remarkable to see it stretched across the backside of a dancing Tanzanian lady. I wish the American people could have seen the outpouring of love. Somebody said, well, you did that to make us light. No, I didn't do that to make us be light. It's not a reason you do things to be light. You did it because it's the right thing to do to save lives. And in my article, I talked about the budget crisis. Well, I understand we're in a budget crisis. But I also put in, this is an opportunity to do something when you look back, you can say to your grandkids, our country saved an entire generation of people. And so thousands and thousands of people were dying, and we started getting antiretrovirals to them. And 50,000 people were getting antiretrovirals when the program started. And thanks to your generosity, it's now over 4 million people. And the chapter, interesting, is called Lazarus, and I'm sure you know why.
And the numbers are amazing from a public health perspective. Your accomplishment was wonderful. You described leaving the White House as going from 100 miles an hour to 0. And
Maybe 5.
Said 10, but okay. You talk about how difficult it was to learn how to relax at first. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm getting better. I mean, I feel less guilty. Not going on, not kind of living every single minute of every single day, going as fast as I can possibly go. Actually, I paced myself pretty well at the White House, just so you know. I mean, the good thing is when you're a president, you can say, I want an hour and a half on my schedule every day for exercise, which I did. And I was very disciplined at times. In other words, I exercised 6 days a week, and I felt it was important to keep physically fit because it helped me mentally. I read the Bible every day, first thing every morning, and I never missed. I'm not saying that I'm a cool guy or better. I'm just telling you, life requires discipline. I'm trying to impart some wisdom here. But anyway, so I read 92 books one year as president. I love to read. People say, well, how can you possibly do that? And it's because I said, it's a priority, is why I could possibly do it. I mean, I had a lot of reading, obviously, as president. Susan, remember the briefing books and all the stuff. Your dad would come home, briefcase full of stuff. No, I didn't read the budget. I hired good people to read the budget. You read the budget? Well, yeah. It's the difference between somebody who's in Congress and somebody who's a governor. But anyway. People say, Hal, I don't watch TV. In all due respect. I really don't. I don't watch the evening shows, news shows. That's news during the presidency a lot of times. And I can't tell you the Dancing with the Stars and all that stuff. I just don't watch it. And so I read. When I traveled on Air Force One, I'd read. When I exercised on the elliptical machine, I'd read. And I read myself to sleep. And the reason I tell you that is I still do the same kinds of things. I exercise daily, and I still read a lot. The difference, of course, is I don't wake up first thing when I get to the Oval Office early in the morning and have CIA there saying, here are the issues that you're going to have to deal with and might be having to deal with. And I got to tell you, I don't miss the limelight at all. Kind of weird to say it here. I'm in the limelight. I'm actually trying to get people to read the book. And frankly, I think it's bad for former presidents. I like the model of President Ford and my dad. When they get off the stage, you get off the stage. It's somebody else's turn. And I don't think it's good for the country nor the presidency for me to be criticizing my successor. And I don't intend to do that. Nor do I intend to be giving you my opinion on the latest issue. And so you're not going to see much of me. And I'm perfectly content with that. I'm a happy guy. I really am. I'm comfortable. I know I gave it my all. The book helped a lot to kind of end the presidency. And now you can be the judge.
Time for a couple
Sure.
more shorter questions.
You mean a couple more shorter answers? Very
I'm
polite.
glad you said it. First one comes from Evan Zeiger. Is Evan? I don't know where Evan's at.
Hey, Evan.
He says he's 10 years old and he'd like to know if you were still president, what would you be doing for Christmas?
Yeah, Camp David, Evan. When my dad was president, he invited I got 4 brothers and a sister, with 4 boys and a girl, 3 brothers and a sister, and Mother and Dad would have us up to Camp David. And Camp David is a big enough place that there's a cabin for every family. And it was really fun. And what was even more fun, Evan, when I was the president, to invite Mother and Dad and my brothers and sister to come, and all their kids. And so we'd be at Camp David. And really a special place to go for Christmas.
So the next one is wrapped into 3 questions. As a
Like the old
base-
press conferences.
as a baseball fan and former owner of the Rangers, what did you think of the World Series?
Well, I
What
was,
happened to the Rangers? Was the second-
yeah, so like, I'm a half glass full guy. It was awesome, man, the World Series. Remember, this is a baseball team that had never been beyond round 1 of the playoffs. The best thing that happened in the World Series was being with my dad, and we went out to the pitcher's mound, and it was unbelievably sweet. It was great. Memory I'll never forget. But it was fun, sitting next to Nolan Ryan, who was my buddy. You know, when I was part of the ownership, Nolan was our star pitcher. And now he's part of the ownership. And talking baseball with him, just hanging out with Laura at a game. Look, baseball is awesome to go to a game with somebody you like. You know, I suggest you do it because there's a lot of downtime. And we had a wonderful time. I never witnessed, you know, like Detroit fans, they've had it throughout the history, had pennant fever. We never had pennant fever before in the Metroplex. And a lot of us got it, and it was exciting, really exciting. And what went wrong? Good pitching could beat good hitting.
Well, we'll finish off with the last one, and that is your book tour. Your book has been published now. You're dedicated the groundbreaking of your presidential library. What's next for George Bush? Does it include skydiving?
Yeah, no, it doesn't include skydiving, but my dad's going to on his 90th birthday, and he said he's going to do it on his 85th, and he did it. Nobody believed he'd do it. So Mother had the great line, you know, on his 85th birthday, he jumped and landed at, or was to land, or did land, at St. Anne's Church by the Sea. And Mother said, of course, he's jumping at a church just in case things don't go well. I am building, so I'm out of politics. I'm interested in politics, but I'm out of politics. You know, I like to watch it. I know that Congressman-elect Isaac is here. I congratulate him. Thank you for your willingness to serve. It's important to have good people serve in politics. I'm interested in the process. You know, I've been through a lot of it myself, so I'm aware of what people are getting ready to go through, particularly those who run for president in 2012, but I'm not going to be out there. I just told you, I believe when you're off the stage, you're off the stage. But I do want to be involved in policy based upon the principles, some of which are articulated here. And so the SMU project is going to be a presidential museum similar to this. We've decided to have not only the museum and the archives, which all former presidents are required by law to have, to store the papers so that historians can browse and study the moments of the presidency, but also to have an institute. And so here's what we're doing, just briefly. One, I believe in accountability in public schools in order to achieve excellence and instigate reform. I don't say you can solve problems unless you measure. On the education front, so not only going to defend accountability, but we believe one way to affect quality education is to better recruit, train principals. And so we've got scholars from around the country that are now at SMU, at the Bush Center, developing curricula and recruiting techniques for school districts. One of the problems we have in our country is, when it comes to principles and accountability is that authority and responsibility are not aligned. So you're a principal and you're a parent and your child isn't doing like what you want at a school. The first person you go see is the principal. And you say, God, you're doing a lousy job, I can't believe this, you know, blah, blah, blah. And what ends up happening is that it turns out the principal doesn't have the authority. Obviously the responsibility, otherwise the mother wouldn't be on him, but not the authority to be able to deal with teacher issues or budget. And so we're doing not only studies, but we're implementing reform in districts starting around Dallas and other places around the country. And out of this reform process, we'll get better information and we keep kind of refining so that hopefully at the end of the time we'll be able to point to 50,000 principals that have been retrained and better qualified to be principals. I'm a defender of the marketplace. One of the interesting things we've done in this area is we had a natural gas symposium. Technology has enabled us to find a lot of natural gas in America. And I happen to believe it's good that energy is be U.S. energy. You know, the less we import, the better off we are economically and from a national security perspective. And yet, you know, people are questioning whether or not the exploration of natural gas using new drilling techniques is necessary and good for the country. So we had people from both sides of the issue come and discuss it. Thirdly, I believe that we ought to continue helping people in the developing world. And so one of the leaders of the PEPFAR program is now designing a better strategies as to how to address some of these compelling issues. Right now, you know, we've got the AIDS tranche and the malaria tranche. So you've got the stovepiped approach to development. And it probably makes sense to cut across the stovepipes to spend money more efficiently and effectively, both from the private and public sector. And so Mark Dieball, who's a famous guy in the development world, is devising the strategy that will then go out and sell to companies that are individuals or church groups or whatever that are interested in actually affecting people's lives in a positive way. And finally, I'm going to work to spread, Laura and I are going to spend the rest of our life spreading freedom. And here's a couple of things we're doing. It's a long answer, but thank you for first of all, sometimes there's a question in a reformer's mind whether anybody ever hears them. And so we're going to have a parallel archive to the archive of my papers where dissidents and political prisoners, underground preachers will be able to store their writings, their diaries, their sermons. There's no place like it in the world. And imagine being a political prisoner who's got letters in Cuba, whose letters have been smuggled out, and that he would know that the letters to the wives will be forever memorialized in a place in the bastion of freedom in America. I believe we got a kid who signed up 1 million people on Facebook to protest the FARC. So he's using social networking to promote freedom is something we're going to do and continue to do. And finally, Laura and I believe women will lead the democracy movement in the Middle East. I just told you it's going to happen in my judgment. And therefore, if you believe it's going to happen, then it seems like to me a good use of time would be to try to facilitate its happening. And women are going to lead the democracy movement, mark my words. And we want to empower women and encourage women and develop civil societies, help develop civil societies so women can benefit. Here's an example. Here's an example. When I was president, Laura's first lady, she went to promote breast cancer awareness in the Middle East. It seemed like a pretty simple thing to do, yet it had never been done. And the cachet of a first lady, or former first lady for that matter, you know, carries some weight, a lot of weight. And I went back there to give some speeches, and people walked up to me, women, said, "What your wife did to create awareness by just simply having one event made a huge difference in the lives of women in the Middle East." And civil society, you know, healthcare is part of civil society. Develop kind of a open-minded approach to something like breast cancer awareness that we take for granted here in America is going to be a useful use of her time and mine as a way to ultimately promote freedom, which is the only way to be able to have a secure generation of Americans. And so that's what we're going to do. Thank you all for your time.